He wasn't supposed to be there. A wounded Marine walked into St. Jude's for stitches hand-wrapped, blood leaking through gauze, eyes begging for quiet. Then the elevator opened. A man stepped out with a rifle and a calm face that didn't belong in a hospital. Doors jammed. The floor locked down. 20 people became hostages in one breath. The Marine had no gun, just one good arm, and a German shepherd at his heel, still as stone, reading the hallway like a battlefield. The gunman thought he'd trapped a ward. He didn't know he'd trapped himself with a Marine who knows how to turn pain into time and a dog who doesn't let its human fall. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. If you believe second chances can come with scars and fur, hit subscribe. Rain stitched the Seattle night to the hospital's glass, each drop a cold nail tapped by an impatient God. Inside St. Jude Memorial, the air tasted of antiseptic, floor wax, and something older fear that hadn't decided to speak yet. Mason Carter stepped in anyway. He was 38, broad-shouldered in the way Marines stayed broad even after they stopped training, and he moved like a man trying to take up less space than he naturally did. A worn brown leather jacket hung on him like a second skin, the seams softened by years and weather. Beneath it, a red and black plaid shirt peeked out at the collar, stubbornly bright against the gray of his life. His hair was cut short, the color of dark sand after rain, and a rough stubble shaded his jaw square, a little too sharp at the angles, as if it had been carved by hard decisions. His left hand was wrapped in gauze that had already surrendered to a spreading bloom of red. The cut wasn't huge, but it was deep, the kind that throbbed with its own pulse and reminded a man that bodies were temporary agreements. Mason kept the injured hand tucked close to his ribs, protecting it the way he used to protect a radio, a map, a buddy's last letter home. He didn't like hospitals. Hospitals were loud in quiet ways, machines chirping, shoes squeaking, strangers breathing around you like waves. They were battlefields where nobody admitted it, where the smell of bleach pretended it could erase blood. Mason had promised himself he'd only be here long enough for stitches and a tetanus shot, long enough to be nobody. That promise was the first lie the night demanded. At his side patted a German shepherd black and tan coat, adult, about 6 years old, thick through the chest with a lean athlete's waist, paws too big to ever look delicate. One ear stood perfectly erect. The other carried a faint, permanent bend at the tip like an old signature. A pale scar crossed the bridge of the dog's muzzle, not ugly, just honest. The dog's eyes were amber and bright, the kind of bright that didn't sparkle so much as measure. People might have called it intelligence, but Mason knew it was more than that. It was vigilance that had grown a soul. The dog wore a simple working collar and a short leash looped around Mason's uninjured hand. No vest, no patches, no announcements. The dog didn't need them. He was the only creature in the building who seemed to know exactly where every exit was without turning his head. Mason had rescued the shepherd 2 winters ago from a county shelter that described him as high-energy, needs-experienced handler. That was polite language for, this dog has seen things and doesn't know how to forget. Mason had looked into those amber eyes and felt something shift, like 2 broken machines recognizing the same missing part. He named him Atlas because the dog carried the weight of Mason's nights without ever asking why. Atlas didn't bark much. He didn't whine. He leaned his shoulder into Mason's leg at the exact moments Mason's mind started slipping toward the old places, the sand, the shouting, the metallic taste of adrenaline. If Mason was a man who had learned to survive by pretending he felt nothing, Atlas was a dog who had learned to survive by noticing everything. Tonight the wound had come from something stupid and ordinary, a jagged strip of metal at a winter job site, snow-dusted concrete, a shortcut through half-finished scaffolding because Mason hated long walks that gave his thoughts room to talk. He'd felt the slice, then the warm slickness under his glove, then the familiar uninvited thought, if it bleeds, it can end. He'd wrapped the hand in his truck with the same efficiency he once used to pack gauze into worse holes. His breathing had been steady, his face had been blank. The job foreman had asked if he needed a ride. Mason had said no, voice flat, like gratitude was a language he understood but didn't speak often. It wasn't that Mason disliked people. It was that people came with questions, and questions were hooks that snagged on his past. 7 years in the Marines had taught him how to talk to men in chaos, short, direct, useful. Coming home had taught him how bad he was at talking to anyone who wanted feelings. That flaw wasn't born in him, it was hammered in. There had been an explosion, once one of those moments the universe edits into slow motion. A friend, a kid really, laughing about a song on the radio, and then the world turning into fire and fragments. Afterward, Mason discovered his mind had installed a new rule: do not get close, because close becomes missing. He drove to St. Jude in silence, Atlas in the passenger seat, the dog's head turned slightly toward him as if listening for the thoughts Mason refused to say out loud. The hospital lobby was bright enough to feel judgmental. A television played a muted morning show rerun to an empty waiting area. A row of plastic chairs sat like obedient soldiers. The check-in desk had a tired-looking potted plant, and behind it a young receptionist named Carly Brooks. Her name tag said it in cheerful font that did not match her eyes. Carly was in her mid-20s, petite and pale, with freckles sprinkled across her nose like someone had flicked cinnamon at her face. Her hair was strawberry blonde, pulled into a messy ponytail that looked like it had survived a long shift and a short patience. She spoke with the practiced softness of someone trained to soothe angry strangers without ever letting them touch her. "Hi, can I help you?" Her gaze flicked to Mason's bleeding bandage, then down to Atlas, then back up with a careful question behind her smile. "Is this dog a problem?" Mason's voice came out low and calm. "Cut my hand. Need stitches." He slid his ID across the counter. Carly's fingers moved quickly, typing, printing, asking the standard questions: pain level, allergies, tetanus, insurance. Mason answered like a man reciting a password. Atlas sat at heel without being told, posture alert but still, tail resting on the tile. When Carly hesitated, eyes on the dog again, Mason added, not defensive, just factual. "He stays with me." Carly considered Mason's face. The hard lines, the steady stare, the way he didn't fidget despite blood-soaking gauze. Then she nodded, as if deciding it wasn't worth a fight. "Okay, keep him close." Mason almost smiled at that. Atlas didn't do far. Mason didn't either. A triage nurse waved him through the double doors. Jenna Park introduced herself with a clipped efficiency that was kind in its own way. She looked about 29, Korean-American, average height with a slim runner's build and shoulders that carried responsibility like a backpack. Her dark hair was tied in a neat bun, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She had warm brown eyes that didn't miss details, and her skin held that faint sheen of someone who lived under fluorescent lights too often. Jenna's expression was composed, but there was a small crease between her brows that suggested she'd learned, the hard way, that bad nights could start with quiet. "Mason Carter?" she confirmed, then glanced at Atlas. "And friend." Her tone didn't mock, it respected. "German Shepherd," Mason said. "His name's Atlas." Atlas looked at Jenna once one quick assessment, like a bouncer checking IDs, then returned his focus to the corridor. Jenna guided Mason into a small exam bay separated by curtains. She spoke while she worked because some people did better with noise. "How'd you do it?" "Metal edge," Mason replied. "Job site." Jenna unwrapped the gauze carefully. The cut was along the palm near the thumb, deep enough to need stitches, not deep enough to steal function if treated right. She cleaned it with saline, and Mason's jaw tightened for half a second, pain flashing like a match. Then he smothered it. Jenna noticed. Nurses always noticed. She didn't comment, but her voice softened. "You're doing great." Mason almost laughed. Great was surviving a place that wanted you dead. Great was getting home when everyone else didn't. This was just biology being inconvenient. Still, something in Jenna's tone landed gently. She moved with steady hands, the kind of hands people trusted with their last seconds. Mason wondered what had made her that way. Maybe a family member's illness? Maybe a childhood where chaos lived in the walls and she'd learned to keep her own chaos neat. Jenna asked, "Any medical history I should know?" Mason's mind flashed to a purple scar along his ribcage, to tinnitus, to nights where sleep turned into a firefight. He chose the smallest truth. "Nothing major," Jenna nodded, accepting the boundary. That was a skill too knowing when not to pry. A voice drifted from the next bay, a man complaining loudly about wait times, the sound sharp with entitlement. Jenna's lips pressed into a thin line. "People forget," she murmured, mostly to herself. Mason didn't ask what she meant. He understood anyway. In war, everyone knew the rules. In a hospital, people pretended there were no rules until fear wrote them in capital letters. Jenna finished the triage checks and told him a doctor would be in soon. "You can wait here," she said, then glanced again at Atlas. "He can stay." Atlas didn't look grateful. He looked prepared. Jenna stepped away, the curtain swaying shut behind her. Mason sat on the edge of the exam bed, boots dangling slightly above the floor, and tried not to listen too hard to the building. That was the thing about Marines. Even when they stopped being Marines, their bodies kept the habit. Mason heard the distant roll of a gurney, the soft click of a door latch, the faint beeping of a monitor somewhere like a metronome marking time. He also heard, beneath all that, the hush of a storm pressing its face to the windows. His injured hand throbbed in sync with his heartbeat, and for a moment he was back under a different kind of fluorescent light, harsh and buzzing, watching a medic wrap a bandage while someone screamed in another room. He blinked hard, dragged himself back into the present, and rested his uninjured hand on Atlas's neck. The dog leaned into it, warm and solid. Mason didn't say thank you. He wasn't good at thank you. But his fingers curled into the dog's fur with a quiet kind of prayer. Minutes stretched. A security guard passed by Ray Donnelly, late 50s, heavy-set with a gray mustache and the weary eyes of a man who'd broken up too many arguments over vending machines. His uniform shirt strained at the buttons, and his belt squeaked when he walked. He offered Mason a nod that was more respect than friendliness, the nod of one working man to another. Mason returned it. Ray's gaze flicked to Atlas and lingered, not afraid. "Good dog," Ray said softly, almost reverently. Atlas didn't wag. He just watched Ray walk away, tracking him until he turned the corner. Mason found himself studying Atlas's face. There was no drama in it, no theatrics, just an unwavering readiness, like a lighthouse that didn't care if ships believed in it. Mason wondered when he'd become a man who needed that kind of steadiness from a dog. He already knew the answer, and he hated it, because the answer was loss. Loss had carved him into someone quieter, someone who preferred the edge of rooms, someone who avoided eye contact because eyes asked for things. The hospital smelled like metal and antiseptic, and now, under it, something else started to creep in, a taste on the air that didn't belong. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't blood. It was tension, thin and sharp, like the moment right before thunder breaks. Mason's shoulders tightened without permission. Atlas rose from sitting, slow and silent, and placed himself slightly ahead of Mason, angled toward the corridor. The dog's ears lifted, his spine straightened, his nostrils flared once, drawing in information. Mason's gaze followed the line of the dog's focus toward the end of the hall where the elevator bank sat beneath harsh lights. The doors were closed, reflecting the corridor like dark mirrors. Atlas stared at them as if they were not doors at all, but a mouth. Mason's wounded hand pulsed. The building's sound seemed to fall into a strange, waiting pause. He didn't know what was coming yet. He only knew the old feeling had returned, the one that said, "Something has entered the perimeter." Atlas held perfectly still, ears rigid, eyes locked on the elevator like a sentinel staring into a myth. And in that stillness, Mason understood with a sick clarity that he wasn't just here for stitches anymore. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that felt indecently polite. For half a second the hallway held its breath. Machines still beeped, distant carts still rolled, but the human part of the building went quiet, like a forest when every bird decides at once not to sing. Mason Carter's eyes stayed on the seam between the doors, and Atlas stood a step ahead of him, body angled like a shield that didn't know it was mortal. Out of the bright rectangle of the elevator stepped a man who didn't belong to the world of wristbands and clipboards. He was tall, 6'4" at least, and built thick through the shoulders and chest, not gym-polished but work-hardened, the way men get when they've hauled something heavy for years that was never a couch. His trench coat was soaked dark from the rain, clinging to him like a second shadow. Heavy boots left wet stamps on the waxed floor. A duffel bag hung off his shoulder, dragging slightly, as if it contained not clothes but consequences. In his hands was a rifle, an AR platform, with a short barrel and a sight that said money and intention. He didn't sweep the hallway in panic. He moved with a calm, practiced weight, the kind of calm that wasn't peace but permission to do harm. His face was long and angular, with a blunt nose, cheeks hollowed by stress or obsession, and a scruff of beard that looked like it had been forgotten rather than grown. His eyes were pale, almost gray, and they carried the flatness of someone who had rehearsed this moment enough times to remove surprise from it. Mason felt the old military math start clicking in his skull, not thoughts exactly, more like measurements. Distance to cover, distance to threat, angles, exits, the uselessness of a wounded hand. Atlas's ears rose higher. The dog's lips didn't curl. He didn't bark. He simply stared at the rifle like it was a snake coiled in the grass. The man walked past Mason's bay without noticing him as anything more than another patient-shaped obstacle. That was the first gift, being underestimated. Then the man spoke, and his voice hit the corridor like a hammer on glass. "Nobody move." It wasn't shouted with hysteria. It was delivered with authority, the way a foreman calls "heads up" before a steel beam swings. The command did what commands are designed to do. It turned living people into statues. Across the hall, a nurse froze mid-step, a clipboard slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the floor with a sound that made everyone flinch. The gunman's head barely twitched at the noise. He was already beyond flinching. He raised the rifle, not at a person yet, but at the ceiling, and squeezed a single round. The shot cracked through the corridor, deafening in the confined space. Tile dust and tiny fragments of fluorescent casing rained down like pale snow. Several patients screamed. A man in a wheelchair jerked so hard he nearly toppled. Atlas's muscles tightened, but he didn't lunge. Mason's hand moved instinctively toward the dog's collar, a quiet leash on fate. The gunman lowered the barrel and spoke again, calmer now, as if he'd simply adjusted the room's volume. "That was your warning." He moved toward the nurse's station where the heart of the wing lived, computers, charts, keys, and the illusion of control. From behind the counter, a young woman stood up slowly with trembling hands. She looked like she'd been poured into scrubs and then forgotten by sleep. Her name tag read, Sarah Caldwell, RN. Sarah was around 31, average height, but slim to the point of looking breakable, as if stress had eaten her appetite. Her hair was chestnut brown, pulled into a messy ponytail with flyaways floating around her face like static. Her skin was fair with a tired, sallow undertone, and her eyes, large, greenish hazel, were the kind that telegraphed every feeling, even when she tried to hide them. She had a soft mouth that didn't know how to be hard, and that was exactly why the world kept testing it. Sarah's hands shook so visibly that Mason could almost hear the tremor. She'd chosen nursing because she believed kindness was a kind of armor. Tonight, it looked like paper. "Please," Sarah whispered, voice thin. "This is a hospital." The gunman's gaze snapped to her, and for the first time his face showed something human contempt mixed with grief, a bitter stew. "Exactly," he said. "A hospital, where people die because someone thinks they're untouchable." He turned the rifle slightly and pointed it toward a man walking fast from the far end of the corridor, a white coat flaring like a flag. Dr. Nolan Pierce came into view. Mid-40s, tall, lean, with dark hair combed back in a neat line that suggested he still believed in order. His jaw was sharp, his cheekbones pronounced, and his eyes were an icy blue behind rectangular glasses. He looked like the kind of surgeon who had been praised so often he started to confuse praise with truth. There was a faint scar near his temple, a thin white mark that might have come from a childhood accident or an adult fight. Either way, it added to his impression of surviving every room he entered. Nolan's reputation, the way staff spoke his name in half sentences, was of brilliance with a blade and arrogance in everything else. He could be generous when he felt like a hero, cutting jokes in the break room, buying coffees for a team that had pulled off an impossible save. But when he was tired, he treated people like equipment, useful or in the way. 3 months ago, an exhausted resident had made a mistake on his watch. The patient lived, but Nolan's fury had scorched the resident so deeply the young doctor transferred departments. Some called Nolan demanding. Others called him cruel. Nolan called it standards. The gunman aimed at him like a verdict. "Stop," he said. Nolan's hands lifted immediately, palms forward, face draining of color in a way that stripped him of godhood. "Listen," Nolan began, voice controlled but cracking at the edges. "We can talk." "You don't get to talk," the gunman cut in. "You talk when you operate. You talk when you sign papers. Tonight, you listen." His eyes narrowed, and the grief under his calm sharpened into a blade. "You remember Marissa Kessler?" Nolan's mouth opened, then closed. The pause was an answer. Nolan swallowed, trying to reconstruct memory like a man searching for a lost chart. I treat a lot of patients." "You treated my wife," the gunman said, voice low now, almost intimate. 3 years ago. Routine procedure, you said, in and out. Home for Christmas." His lips tightened. "She never came home." Nolan's gaze flicked just once toward Sarah, toward the exit, toward anything that might be a lifeline. Mason saw the reflex and understood it. Nolan wanted control back. He wanted the room to return to rules, but a rifle changes rules the way fire changes wood. Sarah made a small sound, half sob, half breath. Mason's mind pressed against his ribs, trying not to run away into detachment. He stayed still, because still was survival. Atlas's tail lowered. His eyes never left the gunman's hands. The gunman, Grant Kessler, though nobody in the corridor knew his name yet, gestured toward the double doors that led to the waiting area. He pulled a rubber wedge from his coat pocket and jammed it under the doors with the quick efficiency of someone who'd planned. "This floor is mine," he said, not boasting, just declaring a law. He swung his gaze across the hallway, taking inventory. "All staff to the station. Patients out of rooms and into the hall, now." A few nurses hesitated, eyes wide, bodies resisting the command the way animals resist stepping into a trap. Grant fired another round, this one into a wall clock above the station. Glass exploded. Time shattered into glittering pieces. "Move," he said, and everyone moved. Panic has a herd instinct. People poured into the corridor. An elderly woman with a walker, a teenage boy pale under a blanket, a man in traction whose face was clenched with pain. Some cried. Some stared, dissociated. Sarah tried to direct them with shaking hands, voice breaking as she said, "Please, please, stay together." Nolan stood rigid, hands still raised, as if lowering them might invite death. Mason watched the chaos swell and felt anger rise. Not hot, not explosive, but cold and deep, the kind that made decisions clean. His wounded hand throbbed, and he hated it for being weak at the wrong time. He hated himself for being here at all. He hated the universe for loving irony. Atlas took one silent step forward, then stopped when Mason's fingers tightened on the leash. The dog's breathing was slow, controlled. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. Grant's gaze finally flicked to Mason, skimming him like a footnote. A man in a leather jacket, bleeding hand, German shepherd. Not staff, not a threat, just a bystander with a dog. Grant's eyes moved on, already forgetting him. Mason felt the strange advantage of being invisible. In war, invisibility was a blessing. In a hospital, it was a knife you could hide. Grant barked orders, forcing Sarah to zip-tie a couple of staff members' wrists as a demonstration. Sarah's hands fumbled, and Grant leaned close enough that Mason could see the stubble on the man's jaw and the tiny twitch at the corner of his eye, fatigue or fury, maybe both. "Tighter," Grant snapped. Sarah flinched and obeyed. Her face was wet with tears, but there was a stubbornness in her chin that suggested she wasn't only afraid, she was ashamed of being afraid. Mason recognized that too. Nolan tried to speak again, voice pleading now. "If this is about your wife, we can review records." "Records," Grant echoed with bitter laughter. "I reviewed them. I spent 3 years reading what you wrote. I know what you did." He pulled a phone from his pocket and waved it like evidence. "Tonight, you confess. On camera. Police will come. Media will come. I want the world to see what a man like you looks like when he finally has to answer." The plan was clear. Spectacle as revenge, humiliation as justice. Mason's stomach tightened. He'd seen men like Grant overseas men who'd lost something and then let loss become their religion. Those men didn't stop until they ran out of bodies to blame. Atlas's ears rotated slightly, catching another sound. Mason followed the dog's micro-shift and realized the elevator hadn't moved again, but the air had changed. That taste of tension sharpened as Grant paced, his boots squeaking on wet floor. Mason cataloged the environment. Nurse station desk possible cover, supply closet unknown, crash carts, metal, wheels, useful, exits, one likely stairwell beyond the line of sight. Security, none visible now. He thought of Ray Donnelly, the guard, and hoped the man had heard the shots. He thought of Jenna Park and wondered where she was in this chaos. He thought of his own useless phone left in his jacket pocket and the fact that calling 911 would be pointless if Grant saw it. Atlas stood steady, an anchor with teeth. Mason leaned down slightly, mouth near the dog's ear, not to give a command out loud, but to share a promise the way you share warmth. "Stay," he breathed. Atlas's gaze flicked to Mason for the briefest moment, amber eyes saying, "I am staying because you are here." Grant turned, scanning the corridor again, and his gaze passed over Mason a second time. This time it lingered, half a beat longer, as if something in Mason's stillness bothered him. Mason made himself smaller, shifted his shoulders into that wounded patient posture, let his face go dull. He knew how to play harmless. He'd played it in bars, in supermarkets, at family gatherings where people asked how he was doing, like it was a weather report. He could play it now, too. Grant's focus moved away. He lifted the rifle and aimed it toward the ceiling again, not firing, just reminding the hallway who owned the oxygen in their lungs. "Everyone on the floor," he ordered. "Hands where I can see them." Bodies sank, blankets and scrubs and fear pooling on the tile. Sarah lowered herself carefully, eyes darting to patients, trying to shield them with her own thin frame. Nolan hesitated, pride fighting survival. Grant stepped forward and pressed the barrel toward Nolan's chest. Nolan dropped. The sound was humiliating knees on tile. Mason watched the surgeon's face contort, and he almost felt pity. Almost. Then Atlas made a sound so soft it barely existed, a low, warning rumble trapped deep in his chest. Grant's head snapped toward it. His eyes locked on the dog, then lifted to Mason. For the first time, Grant saw not a bystander, but a variable. Mason kept his face blank. He kept his injured hand tucked in. He let his breathing stay calm. But inside, the switch had already flipped. The night had moved from waiting to beginning. And the hunter, for all his confidence, had just noticed the cage might have teeth. Mason Carter did not move first. He let the room move around him, like water deciding where to pour. Grant Kessler had forced everyone down to the floor in a rough constellation of bodies, scrubs, patient gowns, blankets, trembling hands. Yet Mason kept himself slightly apart, close enough to be counted, far enough to be forgotten. He angled his shoulders inward, made his broad frame look smaller, and tucked the bleeding hand against his ribs as if pain had bent him. It was a familiar disguise. The harmless man, the quiet patient, the one you don't bother with because you assume he won't matter. That mask came easily to him, because it was the same mask he wore at grocery stores and family dinners, the same one that kept strangers from asking what he'd done overseas, what he'd seen, why he sometimes stared through people like they were fog. Inside that mask, his mind ran clean and cold. He watched Grant's feet, how they planted, how they shifted. He watched Grant's shoulders, how they tightened when someone cried. He watched the rifle where it pointed when Grant turned his head, how casually he let the muzzle drift across a living line of throats. Mason's pulse stayed steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear was an old neighbor and he'd learned how to keep the door locked. Atlas stayed at Mason's knee, sitting like an obedient statue with warm blood under his fur. The dog's ears remained high, but his mouth was closed, tongue hidden, breathing quiet and controlled. A less trained dog would have barked, would have announced rage or panic. Atlas did not. Atlas observed. In the dog's amber eyes, Grant was not a man with a story. He was a threat, with hands. Mason's fingers rested lightly on the leash looped around his good hand, loose enough to look casual, tight enough to be truth. Sarah Caldwell, still near the nurse's station, was shaking so hard her ponytail seemed to tremble with her. She tried to be a wall for the patients, but she was built like a reed slim, narrow-shouldered, her face pale beneath the fluorescent glare. Her kindness was visible the way bruises were visible. It marked her. Dr. Nolan Pierce was on the floor too, knees pressed into tile, hands up like surrender was a religion he'd never practiced until tonight. His pride had been forced into a small, humiliating shape, and it didn't sit well on his sharp features. Grant paced in front of them, trench coat dripping, boots squeaking faintly, duffel bag slumped nearby like a coiled secret. He kept talking, not ranting, lecturing. He spoke of justice and truth and the camera he planned to use. It was the voice of a man who had been alone with his grief so long it had started giving him commands. Mason recognized that kind of loneliness. It made people do terrible math to feel less helpless. Grant's gaze swept the group again, snagging on Atlas for a heartbeat, then on Mason. "Your dog growled," Grant said, voice low, almost curious. "Dogs sense bad people," Mason replied without looking up. He made the word sound dumb, harmless, like something a tired patient would say to fill silence. He let his tone carry the mild, everyday stupidity that dangerous men ignored. Inside, his brain noted the truth. Grant was testing him. "Is that what you think?" Grant asked, stepping closer, rifle angled down but not relaxed. Up close, the man's face showed the fine details of neglect-chapped lips, a faint shadow beneath his eyes, and a muscle jumping at his jaw like a trapped insect. His beard stubble looked more like exhaustion than style. "No," Mason said softly. "I think dogs sense intent." Atlas did not move. He did not bare teeth. He simply watched Grant's hands the way a lifeguard watched waves. Grant's eyes narrowed. "What's your name?" "Mason," Mason said. He did not offer a last name. Names were handles. "Why are you here, Mason?" Mason lifted his bandaged hand slightly, just enough for the red stain to look dramatic. "Because Seattle's full of sharp things," he said. It was a small joke, not funny but human. Grant's expression did not change, yet the question in his eyes shifted from suspicion to irritation. A harmless wound, a dumb line, a dog sitting, not worth the energy. Grant turned away, and Mason let his shoulders sag a fraction, as if relief had made him boneless. He watched the rifle's muzzle drift off him and felt the smallest exhale slide out of his chest. In that moment, he did something that looked like a mistake to anyone else. He spoke again. "Hey!" he called out, voice slightly louder, like a man too slow to understand danger. Grant's head snapped back. The corridor stiffened. Sarah flinched. Nolan's eyes widened with silent fury at Mason's stupidity. Atlas remained still, but his tail lowered another inch, muscles coiled. Grant lifted the rifle a few degrees. "What?" he said, each letter sharp. Mason kept his face slack, his posture mild, and he delivered the line like a man asking about parking validation. "I'm just here for stitches, man. Does the hospital do refunds if I die before the copay clears?" For half a second, the coroner didn't know what to do with humor. It was a foreign object in the throat of terror. Then Jenna Park, the triage nurse who had been moving patients into the hall under Grant's orders, caught Mason's eye from the far side of the crowd. Jenna's face was damp with stress, but her gaze stayed bright and focused. She had that rare clinical calm that didn't come from numbness. It came from deciding, again and again, not to fall apart. Mason saw her lips twitch. She fought it, tried to keep her composure, and failed just enough for a tiny, almost invisible sound to escape her, something between a laugh and a sob. A pinprick of light. Grant stared at Mason, baffled, as if the man with the bleeding hand had broken the script. "You think this is funny?" Grant said. Mason shook his head quickly, exaggeratedly. "No, sir. I'm just bad at dying quietly." The words were true in a way Grant could not understand. Mason's humor wasn't bravery, it was camouflage. It painted him as foolish, as harmless, as someone who didn't deserve a bullet yet. Grant's lips curled, not into a smile, but into contempt. "Shut up," he said, and swung his gaze back to Nolan. "You," he barked at the surgeon. "You're going to answer." He pushed Nolan's shoulders with the rifle barrel, forcing him to shift position like furniture. Nolan's face tightened. Jenna steadied a frail older patient nearby, a woman in her late 70s with silver hair braided down one shoulder, wearing a pale blue gown and clutching a walker. Her name bracelet read Lillian Hart. Lillian's skin was paper-thin and spotted with age, but her eyes were fierce, dark, and stubborn. Even on the floor, she carried herself like the kind of grandmother who'd survived poverty, childbirth, and bad men without ever granting them the honor of seeing her afraid. "Don't you look at him," Lillian muttered toward Grant, voice raspy with smoke-free years and righteous anger. Jenna gently pressed a hand to Lillian's shoulder, whispering for her to stay quiet. Lillian's jaw worked like she was chewing her fear into something digestible. Nearby, a young resident doctor crawled closer to a patient who was hyperventilating. The resident's name tag read Priya Desai, M.D. Priya looked about 32, Indian American, medium height with a compact, energetic build, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun that didn't allow a single strand to rebel. She had deep-set brown eyes and a calm face that seemed practiced, as if she'd learned early that panic was contagious, and she refused to be a carrier. A thin gold chain lay at her throat, the only softness in her uniform. Priya had been on too many overnight shifts, had seen too many families collapse in waiting rooms, and somewhere along the line she'd stopped flinching at alarms. She spoke in a low, steady voice to the patient beside her, guiding breaths, turning chaos into counts. Mason tracked her movements and stored the fact that she was competent and brave in the quiet way that didn't earn applause. Grant didn't notice Priya. He noticed only the center of his obsession, Nolan, and the story he wanted to force from him. That tunnel vision was both Grant's weapon and his weakness. Mason used the space it created. He shifted his weight slightly, inching his body so he could see the nurse's station more clearly. On the desk he spotted a ring of keys half hidden beneath a stack of charts, a box of zip ties, a phone pushed face down, and a pair of trauma shears glinting under the lights. The shears were just scissors to most people, but Mason's mind noted them anyway, because in a room where guns ruled, anything sharp became a vote. Atlas's nose dipped once, sniffing the air. Not fear. Information. The dog's gaze flicked toward Jenna, then back to Mason, then back to Grant. It was a conversation without words. "I see what you see." Mason did not look at Jenna again, not directly. Direct looks were messages. Messages got people killed if the wrong person read them. Instead, he breathed out slowly and let his eyes drop as if he were ashamed of his own stupid joke. He kept playing the role. He even added a soft, apologetic mutter, just loud enough for Jenna, who was close to hear. "Sorry, talking helps me not shake." Jenna's eyes softened. She gave the tiniest nod, almost imperceptible, the kind of nod soldiers gave each other across noise when they couldn't say the real plan. Sarah Caldwell, still near the station, looked at Mason with startled confusion, then with something like gratitude. She didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened half an inch, as if his absurd line had reminded her she was still human under the fear. Grant shoved his boot against the duffel bag, pulling it closer to his leg, and continued outlining his trial. He wanted the police to arrive. He wanted cameras. He wanted the story of Marissa Kessler to be stamped into the world in Nolan Pierce's humiliation. Mason listened and understood the deeper truth. Grant wasn't just angry, he was drowning. He needed the world to confirm that his grief meant something. Men like that were dangerous because they didn't seek survival. They sought meaning. Mason had been that kind of man once, after the explosion, after the funeral calls, after the flag folded into triangles and handed over like a receipt for sacrifice. The difference was that Mason had found Atlas and built a smaller life that didn't require blood to feel real. Grant had built a shrine to pain and stocked it with bullets. Mason's injured hand throbbed again, and he let his face pinch as if the pain had simply caught up to him. He used it. Pain made him look weak. Weakness made Grant ignore him. He shifted closer by another inch, dragging his boot slightly to create a soft scuff, then freezing as if afraid he'd be punished. Grant didn't turn. Atlas remained seated, perfectly obedient, the picture of a dog being a dog, even though every fiber in him vibrated with readiness. Jenna moved again, guiding Lillian and a couple of patients into a tighter cluster. Priya kept counting breaths with her hyperventilating patient, voice steady as a metronome. Sarah wiped her cheeks with the back of her wrist, then stared at her own shaking hands like she wanted to slap courage into them. Nolan swallowed hard, eyes darting, trapped between guilt and anger and the possibility that he truly didn't remember the woman Grant mourned. And Mason, the bleeding man who had come for stitches, became what he had been trained to become long ago, part of the environment, a harmless shape, a quiet shadow, a problem nobody solved until it was too late. The chapter ended not with gunfire, but with a smaller sound. Jenna Parks almost laughed, turning into a steady breath, as if Mason's foolish question about refunds had pinned a tiny banner of hope to the wall of terror, and Atlas still sitting at Mason's knee, watching the elevator like a faithful myth, waiting for the exact heartbeat when dog would no longer be enough. Grant Kessler didn't tighten the cage with more bullets. He tightened it with a name, and names hit harder when they're soaked in grief. He paced once, boots whispering on wet tile, then stopped as if he'd reached the center of the story he'd rehearsed in his head for 3 years. "Bring her," he said, voice low but absolute, and the way he said it made the words sound less like a request and more like a verdict. The patients and staff on the floor turned their heads in tiny increments, careful not to move too much, because even curiosity felt like a crime with a rifle present. Mason Carter stayed angled downward, shoulders rounded, his bandaged hand held close to his ribs like a small animal he didn't want anyone to notice. Inside, he felt his mind go still and sharp, the way it did before a door got kicked in, the way it did before a night went bad. Atlas remained seated at Mason's knee, posture obedient, eyes bright and unblinking. The dog's stillness wasn't calm. It was coiled restraint, the kind a predator has when it decides to wait for the exact heartbeat. Sarah Caldwell's face was blotchy from tears, her slim frame folded into itself as she tried to shield a trembling teenager with her own body, though she looked like she'd snap if the wind changed. Dr. Nolan Pierce held his hands up, jaw clenched hard enough to make the tendons in his neck stand out, his blue eyes darting between Grant and the station as if logic might still apply if he stared long enough. Jenna Park crouched near a cluster of patients, her runner's build tense under her scrubs, her gaze moving in controlled sweeps, counting people, counting exits, counting seconds the way nurses counted breaths. Grant lifted the rifle and pointed not at Nolan, but past him, toward the corridor that led to the cardiac wing. "Dr. Claire Whitman," he called out, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, and the name seemed to drain color from the faces around him. A few nurses flinched, like that name carried weight even without a gun attached. Somewhere beyond the curtain line a door opened, and footsteps came fast but measured, someone trying to look composed while walking into a storm. Dr. Claire Whitman appeared at the end of the hallway under the harsh fluorescent spill, and for a moment Mason understood why people followed her in crisis. She moved like she had already decided what must be done and had no time to be afraid. Claire was in her late 30s, tall for a woman around 5'10", with a lean, athletic frame that suggested early mornings and long shifts had shaped her into something efficient. Her hair was dark auburn, pulled into a tight bun at the base of her skull, but a few strands had escaped and clung to her temples with rain or sweat. Her skin was olive-toned, usually warm, but now paled under the lights. Still, her posture didn't collapse. Her face had strong angles, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a mouth that had learned to stay neutral even when her heart wanted to scream. Her eyes were a steady hazel, sharp and assessing, the eyes of someone used to reading monitors, reading blood loss, reading the truth under other people's lies. She wore hospital scrubs under a white coat that looked too clean for the night she'd been having, and her hands, long-fingered, surgeon's hands, were raised slowly in a universal sign of, "I'm not your enemy." Yet even in surrender, there was a quiet authority in her, a spine made of duty. Mason noticed something else too, a faint tremor at her right thumb, tiny and controlled, like a secret leak in the dam. That tremor didn't come from fear of death. It came from recognizing a specific nightmare. The gunman's face changed when he saw her. Not rage first recognition, then rage arrived behind it, like thunder behind lightning. "There she is," Grant said, voice roughening, and he took 2 steps forward. Up close, the rifle looked even more obscene against the clean geometry of the ward. "You remember Marissa Kessler, don't you?" Claire's gaze flicked briefly to Nolan Pierce, then back to Grant, and Mason caught the subtle human truth there. Doctors remembered cases differently than families did. Families remembered faces and promises. Doctors remembered complications and probabilities, and the terrible coin flips inside a human chest. "I'm sorry," Claire said, and her voice carried the calm of a woman trained to say the word without shattering. "I remember Marissa." That admission hit Grant like gasoline finding a match. "You said she'd be home," he snapped. "You said it like you were reading the weather. You said it like it didn't matter." Claire swallowed, throat working. "I told you the plan," she replied carefully. "I told you the risks." "I don't," Grant barked. And in that single syllable, Mason heard the kind of pain that refused to be corrected. Grant wasn't here for medical nuance. He was here for a simple villain to hold responsible, because simple villains made grief feel manageable. He jabbed the air with the rifle's muzzle, not touching her, but close enough that the threat kissed her space. "You hid behind charts," he said. "Behind your colleagues, behind the hospital lawyers. I spent 3 years learning your name, learning your face, learning your schedule. Tonight, you don't hide." Claire's eyes stayed on the rifle, then on Grant's hands, and Mason recognized the same kind of assessment he was doing. She was measuring him too, his balance, his breath. How much of him was performance and how much was ready to kill. But she couldn't act. She had nothing except words, and words were weak currency in a room ruled by metal. Mason felt something old rise in him, not heroism, not drama responsibility. He hadn't come here to save anyone. He'd come for stitches, anonymity, a quick escape back to the quiet life he'd built with a dog and routines. Yet war had trained him in a cruel lesson. The moment you see the threat clearly, you own a piece of the outcome, whether you asked for it or not. He hated that lesson. It had cost him friends. It had cost him sleep. But it was stitched into him deeper than any cut on his hand. Grant turned slightly, angling the rifle so it covered both Claire and Nolan. "This is the trial," he announced to the corridor like a preacher addressing a congregation of the terrified. "Witnesses are present. The guilty are present." His eyes were wet now, not tears falling, but moisture shining, the body's betrayal of a man trying to be stone. "You're going to tell them," he said to Claire, "what you did. You're going to tell them how you killed her." Claire's jaw tightened, and Mason saw the flicker of anger beneath her composure. A surgeon's anger, the kind that came from knowing you'd spent your life fighting death and still being accused of inviting it. "I did not kill your wife," Claire said, and she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The firmness of it was its own weapon. "Your wife had a catastrophic complication. We did everything we could." Grant's laugh was short and broken. "Everything you could," he echoed, and the words sounded like poison in his mouth. "Except tell the truth." The hallway felt smaller, as if the ceiling had lowered. Sarah made a whimpering sound and pressed her face against her forearm, trying to disappear into cloth. Lillian Hart muttered something like a prayer that sounded more like a curse. Priya Desai kept a hand on her hyperventilating patient's shoulder, steadying breath, eyes focused, refusing to let panic spread. Jenna Park shifted slightly, crawling a few inches as she reorganized the cluster of patients into tighter proximity, not for comfort, but for control, fewer stragglers, fewer easy targets. Mason watched Jenna's movement and made a decision that felt like stepping onto thin ice. He needed her, not as bait, not as a hero, just as a second pair of hands with a working brain. He couldn't call police. He couldn't rush a rifle with one good hand and a bleeding palm. But he could plant a plan. He could shape chaos into a door. He used the only opening Grant's obsession provided. Grant was focused on Claire, locked into his own myth. Mason lowered his head as if dizzy and scooted an inch closer, slow enough to look pathetic, eyes down so he didn't signal. Atlas adjusted too, barely just enough to remain tight to Mason's leg, just enough to keep the leash from snagging, just enough that anyone watching would only see a dog being a dog. Mason timed his breath with the noise of Grant's voice and leaned his mouth toward Jenna's direction without fully turning. When Jenna's eyes found him, sharp, wary Mason let his face stay dull, then used the smallest movement of his lips to send sound without broadcasting it. "When I signal," he whispered, the words barely a thread, "you run. Don't look back. Get to the stairwell. Take whoever can move." Jenna's pupils widened a fraction. For a beat, she looked like she wanted to argue because nurses didn't abandon patients, and Jenna's entire career was built on the refusal to leave someone behind. Mason understood that instinct. It was the same instinct that had gotten Marines killed when they went back for someone in the wrong moment. He didn't have time for a debate. He kept his voice flat, command disguised as comfort. "You're not running away," he murmured. "You're making space. You're saving more." Jenna's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She gave a tiny nod, so small it might have been a muscle twitch. Her face didn't turn brave. It turned focused, which was better. Grant's voice rose, sharp and accusing, as he demanded Claire confess, and Claire held her ground with the calm of a woman who had stood over open chests and refused to panic. That calm only enraged him more. Mason felt Atlas shift closer, and then, in a gesture so gentle it almost broke him, the dog pressed his nose against Mason's bandaged hand. The contact was warm and grounding, a quiet reminder carved in fur and breath. Pain doesn't cancel purpose. Mason's fingers tightened around the leash, not hard, not cruel, just enough to answer Atlas's touch with his own silent vow. He didn't speak it out loud. He didn't need to. In the fluorescent glare of St. Jude's, with a grieving hunter holding court and a surgeon standing accused, Mason made the oldest promise a soldier could make without any flag or uniform present. He would not let the helpless pay for someone else's heartbreak if he still had a heartbeat to spend. Mason Carter understood something Grant Kessler didn't. A hospital wasn't just hallways and fear. It was a kingdom of tools pretending to be harmless. Everything here had a purpose. Every cart, every cord, every heavy box that sat under a desk like an ignored stone, and Mason had spent enough years in uniform to recognize a battlefield, even when it wore clean floors and polite signage. He stayed low, shoulders rounded, the wounded hand held close like it might fall off if anyone looked at it too hard, because the mask still mattered. Grant's obsession with Dr. Claire Whitman was a lantern that pulled every insect of his attention toward one flame, and Mason intended to move in the dark around it. Atlas remained pressed against Mason's leg, breathing slow, eyes bright, a quiet guardian in fur 6 years old, black and tan, scar across his muzzle like a thin lightning bolt, one ear perfect and one ear bent at the tip, as if even fate had once tried to fold him and failed. Sarah Caldwell kept whispering to patients in a voice that trembled but didn't break. Her slim frame bowed over them like a reed trying to shelter a field from hail. Jenna Park crouched with her runner's posture compact strength, watchful eyes, her face tight with responsibility. Priya Desai stayed steady with a hyperventilating patient, counting breaths like prayer beads. Lillian Hart's fierce old eyes tracked Grant with the stubbornness of someone who'd survived enough years to refuse letting one loud man write the ending. Grant stalked between bodies like a judge who'd decided the verdict long ago, rifle always present, grief always louder than reason, demanding Claire admit a crime she insisted was a complication. Mason listened to Grant's words and heard the deeper music beneath them. A man who needed control because the world had once taken it away. That kind of man didn't just threaten lives, he threatened meaning. And Mason, who had once lost friends to chaos, knew how dangerous it was when someone tried to force the universe to make sense at gunpoint. He needed a chance to get close, not as a hero. Mason hated that word because it sounded like applause, but as a man who didn't want strangers to die while he sat quietly and pretended his pain was the only thing that mattered. The opening arrived dressed as kindness. Lillian's breathing grew raspier as she knelt, her age dragging on her joints like chains. She tried to stand, stubbornly, and her walker scraped the tile with a squeal. Grant's head snapped toward the noise. His rifle angled. Lillian lifted her chin, eyes dark and defiant, and muttered something that could have been a curse or a joke. Mason felt Atlas tense, a silent spring. Before Grant could decide whether to punish the noise, Mason raised his good hand, palm open in the universal language of harmlessness. He made his voice small, a patient's voice, not a Marine's. "Sir," he said, carefully respectful, carefully stupid, "that lady's gonna fall. Let me move her closer to the wall. Less mess for you." The phrase "less mess" landed in the place Grant's mind still understood. Efficiency. Grant didn't want chaos that he didn't direct. He wanted the world to obey his script. Grant's pale eyes narrowed at Mason, assessing him again. Leather jacket, bleeding hand, dog sitting obediently. A man who talked like he didn't know when to stop talking. Not a threat. "Do it," Grant said, the words sharp. "Slow, and the dog stays." Mason nodded too quickly as if gratitude had scared him. He inched toward Lillian on his knees, moving carefully so his boots didn't scrape loudly. Atlas stayed, but the leash was slack enough that Mason could feel the dog's attention like a second heartbeat. Mason reached Lillian and offered his forearm. Lillian looked him up and down with the penetrating suspicion of grandmothers everywhere. Up close, she smelled faintly of lavender soap and old determination. Her silver braid was slightly undone, wisps of hair floating like smoke around her face. "You got yourself into trouble, son," she rasped. Mason's mouth twitched. "Not my best hobby," he murmured. Lillian's eyes flicked to the blood on his bandage. "That from him?" she asked, nodding toward Grant. "No," Mason whispered, "from being dumb earlier." Lillian gave a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a cough. Humor in terror was a tiny rebellion. Mason helped her scoot 2 feet closer to the wall, enough to look like he was following orders, enough to change the geometry of the room. From this new angle, he could see the nurse's station more clearly, the crash cart parked nearby, the glint of trauma shears tucked in a slot, the coil of heavy-duty zip ties in a plastic bin, and beneath the counter, half hidden in shadow, a squat rectangular box with a power cord. The battery backup unit, an uninterruptible power supply, heavy and dull like a brick of responsibility nobody thanked. A pen lay on the desk, too, cheap plastic, blue cap, the kind that could sign discharge papers or stab a myth if thrown at the right moment. Mason's mind did not romanticize these things, it cataloged them. Tools, weight, edges, options. He guided Lillian's walker so it wouldn't squeal again, then angled his body as if to retreat. Grant's attention had already swung back to Claire because grief was a magnet and Claire was its metal. Mason used the borrowed seconds. He lowered his gaze like a chastened man, but he let his eyes skim Jenna Park just a flick, just enough to remind her of the whisper he'd given her. "When I signal, run." Jenna's face tightened, the crease between her brows deepening, but she nodded once, tiny, fierce. Sarah Caldwell watched Mason with wide hazel eyes, confusion and hope wrestling in her expression. Priya kept her breathing count steady, her voice a quiet metronome in the chaos. Mason returned to the floor near his original spot, still keeping his wounded hand tucked, still playing small. Atlas resumed sitting at his knee as if nothing had changed. Grant continued his trial, voice rising, demanding confession, demanding a universe that could be edited into a clean moral. Claire Whitman stayed composed, hands raised, eyes sharp. Even under accusation, she radiated the calm of a surgeon who had stared into open chests and refused to panic. That calm made Grant's anger hotter, more humiliating to him, because it suggested she might survive his hatred without bowing to it. Grant turned away briefly to check the wedged doors and the corridor, scanning for police or movement. It was an ordinary motion, just a glance, just a shift of the rifle as his focus flickered from his chosen victim to his perimeter. In war, Mason had learned that the smallest flicker could be a doorway. He took it. He didn't explode upward like a man trying to win a movie. He moved like a man who had practiced surviving, low, fast, quiet. His good hand shot toward the nurse's station edge where the battery backup sat beneath the counter. He hooked it with his fingers and dragged it just enough that its weight shifted into his control, then rose to a crouch. Pain flared in his injured hand as his body tightened, but he used the pain the way he'd used it before, as information, not a command. Atlas rose with him, silent, perfectly timed. Grant heard the movement, maybe not the sound, but the change in air. He started to turn back, rifle swinging toward Mason out of instinct. That was the moment Atlas stopped playing dog. The German shepherd surged forward, just one step controlled, not frantic, and clamped his jaws onto the fabric of Grant's pant leg near the calf. Not flesh. Cloth. A hard, decisive grip that yanked Grant's balance sideways by a fraction, the kind of fraction that mattered when a muzzle was trying to align with a chest. Grant stumbled half a step, surprised. His rifle swung off line. His face twisted with sudden fury and shock, as if the laws of nature had just insulted him. Mason used the gap. He came in close, not aiming for heroics, aiming for function. His good hand snapped up with the trauma shears lifted from the cart in the same heartbeat his body rose, and he jammed them into the rifle's moving heart in a brutal, ugly motion that did not require finesse, only commitment. Metal shrieked. The weapon's smooth certainty died into a stubborn jam, suddenly less a ruler of life and more a heavy club. Grant roared, trying to wrench the rifle free, and his hands tightened on it in reflex. Mason swung the battery backup unit pure weight, pure blunt consequence, into Grant's wrist. The impact made a sound like breaking hard fruit. Grant's grip failed. The rifle slipped free and clattered onto the wet tile with a sharp metallic crash that echoed down the corridor like a bell ringing for judgment. For a blink, everything froze. Even fear paused, startled by the idea that the gun could fall. Sarah's mouth opened in a silent scream. Jenna's eyes widened, then sharpened. Priya's hand tightened on her patient's shoulder, anchoring them. Lillian Hart muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," with the grim satisfaction of someone watching a bully finally get interrupted. Claire Whitman's gaze flicked to the fallen rifle and then to Mason, recognition dawning like sunrise. This bleeding man wasn't just a patient. Grant staggered back, clutching his wrist, trench coat swinging, face contorted, rage cracking his calm wide open. Atlas released the pant leg the instant the muzzle was no longer a threat, stepping back into Mason's space like a disciplined shadow ready for the next command. Mason stood over the fallen rifle, chest rising and falling, his injured hand burning, his eyes steady. He didn't look triumphant. He looked resigned, like a man who'd hoped the world would let him be quiet tonight and had been refused. He met Jenna's gaze for half a heartbeat and gave the smallest signal with his chin. Now. And as Grant drew breath to howl, as his fingers reached for whatever other weapon grief had packed for him, the ward's white lights hummed overhead like indifferent stars, witnessing the moment the hunter finally learned the cage contained teeth. The rifle on the floor didn't end the danger, it only changed its shape. For a single stunned breath, the corridor held a silence so tight it felt like the building itself was listening, waiting to see which god would speak next, mercy or ruin. Grant Kessler's face twisted as he clutched his wrist, pain dragging his features into something feral. The calm mask was gone now, stripped off by humiliation. He wasn't a judge anymore. He was a wounded animal with a plan still burning in his head. Mason Carter stood over the fallen weapon without touching it, because he didn't need it. He needed time, movement, and the right kind of chaos. Atlas pressed close, muscles tense, eyes locked on Grant's hands rather than his mouth. The dog understood the oldest truth of violence. Hands decide fate faster than words. Now, Mason breathed, not a shout, not a speech, just a command folded into air, and Jenna Park reacted like the professional she was. Jenna's face hardened into focus, and she began pushing people toward the stairwell in quick, controlled gestures, her slim, athletic body moving between patients like a shepherd guiding a panicked flock. Sarah Caldwell's knees slipped on the wet tile, but she caught herself and grabbed a trembling teenager by the sleeve, pulling them in the direction Jenna pointed, her hazel eyes wide and glassy, her chestnut hair coming loose from its ponytail like stress was actively undoing her. Priya Desai stayed low with her hyperventilating patient, counting breaths fast. In, out, turning panic into rhythm. And Lillian Hart, fierce even now, snapped, "Listen to the nurse!" at anyone freezing, her silver braids swinging as she crawled forward like stubbornness could be armor. Dr. Claire Whitman's gaze was fixed on Grant, her hands still raised, her posture steady, as if her calm could keep the whole floor from tipping into the abyss. Dr. Nolan Pierce looked like he wanted to run and scream and vomit all at once, his neat hair disheveled for the first time, his pride cracking under the weight of being helpless. Mason didn't have the luxury of watching them all. He watched only Grant, because Grant was the match, and the hospital was a room full of paper. Grant's eyes flicked to the fallen rifle, then to Mason, then to the duffel bag near his boot. He lunged, trench coat swinging, snatching the bag with his good hand and dragging it toward the far corridor that led deeper into the wing. "You think you won?" he snarled, voice ragged, and there was a terrible joy in it, the joy of someone about to drag everyone into his grief, whether they consented or not. Mason felt the old, cold clarity settle into his bones. "He's not done," Mason muttered, not for drama, but as a warning meant for himself as much as anyone. Atlas's ears rotated toward the direction Grant moved, and the dog's body angled instinctively to follow, but Mason's leash hand tightened just enough to keep Atlas from charging blindly. A dog could be brave, a dog could also be bait. Mason needed Atlas smart. Grant staggered down the corridor, and as he went, his duffel bag unzipped under his frantic grip, spilling pieces of intent zip ties, a small bottle of clear liquid, a crumpled lighter, and a folded rag that looked like it had been soaked and dried and soaked again. Mason didn't need to name it to recognize the smell that hit the air a second later, sharp, chemical, the sting of rubbing alcohol or solvent. Grant didn't fire the rifle. He didn't need to. He was moving toward something worse, the oxygen storage room, marked by a red sign and a reinforced door with a small window. Mason had seen it earlier when he was cataloging the environment. Now the memory flashed like a warning flare. Oxygen wasn't fire, but it fed fire the way gossip fed rage, fast, hungry, unstoppable once it started. Grant slammed a shoulder into the oxygen room door, found it locked, and let out a frustrated, wounded howl. Then he did what desperate men did. He made noise. He smashed the small window with the butt of his pistol. Yes, he still had a pistol, and the glass popped with a brittle snap. He reached inside, fumbling for the internal latch. The motion was clumsy with pain, and for a heartbeat Mason considered rushing him. But the corridor was wet, bodies were moving, and a direct sprint could cost Mason the one thing he had left: control. He chose the smarter war. "Evacuate!" Mason barked, and his voice came out different now, deeper, sharper, carrying the authority that made people obey even before they understood. It wasn't a Marine's volume, it was a Marine's certainty. Jenna looked at him once, eyes meeting his, and Mason gave her the simplest map: stairwell, low to the ground. "Don't stop." Jenna nodded, her face pale but focused, and began moving the cluster in a tighter line, keeping the weak in the middle. Sarah grabbed extra blankets from a cart, tossing them over shoulders like makeshift shields. Priya helped a patient in traction shift onto a sheet, then signaled for help with 2 fingers. Mason moved to assist, but his wounded hand screamed the moment he tried to grip fabric. Pain shot up his arm like a warning siren. He swallowed it. Pain was information. It meant the hand still worked. He used his forearm and shoulder instead, hauling the sheet by hooking it under his elbow, turning his whole body into leverage. Atlas darted forward and back, not frantic, but purposeful, checking corners, finding openings, returning to Mason's side each time like a compass needle snapping north. Then the building announced the next chapter of its own horror. A high, piercing alarm screamed through the ward. Red lights began to strobe. The overhead speakers crackled, and an automated voice calm as a bored deity repeated, "Code red, code red," fire reported. The sound of sprinklers followed like a sudden storm inside the storm, hissing, then pounding as water burst from the ceiling in hard sheets, turning the polished floor into slick glass. People cried out, someone slipped, someone shouted a name. The air thickened with the first breath of smoke, thin at first, then heavier, rolling low like a black tide hunting lungs. Mason's stomach tightened. Fire moved faster than courage. Grant had succeeded in lighting something, somewhere, and now the hospital was being forced to remember it was made of burnable things. Through the corridor's shifting haze, Mason saw orange flicker near the oxygen room doorway. Small, hungry tongues of flame licking at the edge of the hall. Grant's silhouette moved in that light like a demon in a children's book, and his voice carried, rough and triumphant, "If I go down, you go down with me." He coughed, and the cough sounded wet. He wasn't invincible, he was just committed. Mason dropped lower, keeping his face near the floor where the air was cleaner, and gestured sharply. "Down," he ordered, and people instinctively followed, crawling rather than walking as smoke thickened above them. Atlas stayed low too, moving like a shadow with paws. The dog barked once one clean bark toward a patient who had collapsed, then ran to that person, nudging their shoulder with his muzzle, not to comfort, but to wake them into motion. The bark was a flare gun of sound. Here, someone is stuck. Mason reached the fallen patient, Mr. Henderson, the big knee replacement man with the stubborn mouth, and saw the man's eyes wide with terror, his hands scrabbling on wet tile. Henderson was huge, maybe 250 pounds, gray hair plastered to his forehead, face red with panic. "I can't! My knee!" he gasped. In a different night, Henderson might have been the kind of man who complained about hospital food and parking fees. Tonight, he was just a frightened human who wanted to live. Mason's gaze snapped to Grant's trench coat, still on the floor near where the earlier struggle had happened, heavy, waterlogged, thick fabric perfect for dragging. Mason's mind clicked. "You paid to lie down," Mason muttered, a grim humor in his voice. "Congratulations. You're getting your money's worth." Henderson blinked at him like he couldn't believe jokes still existed, then made a strangled, half-laughing sob. Mason yanked the trench coat open across the tile like a sled, shoved it under Henderson's hips, and barked, "Get on! Now! Henderson hesitated, pride flaring even in fear. The smoke thickened and burned their throats. Mason didn't negotiate. "Move," he said, and the word had teeth. Henderson scrambled onto the coat, clinging to it like a child clinging to a blanket, and Mason hooked the coat's collar with his good hand and forearm, pulling with legs and back instead of fingers, using his whole body like a tow truck. The slick floor helped. The water turned friction into a favor. Atlas ran ahead, weaving through bodies, then stopped at the corridor bend and barked twice. 2 barks, quick warning of a fallen gurney blocking a clean path. Mason dragged Henderson around it, chest heaving, wounded hand pulsing hot. He tasted copper where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. He didn't stop. Jenna was already forming a moving chain, ambulatory patients crawling or shuffling, non-ambulatory patients on sheets, wheelchairs, pushed by shaking hands, blankets over heads like ritual offerings to whatever God spared lungs. Sarah crawled beside a young woman post-op, whispering, "Stay with me, stay with me." Her voice cracked but determined. Priya kept checking pulses and oxygen levels with nothing but her fingers and instinct, her calm face shining with water and sweat. Lillian Hart moved stubbornly in the center of the group, muttering prayers that sounded suspiciously like threats. Dr. Claire Whitman stayed with the cluster too, her surgeon's brain shifting instantly from accused to triage, her eyes scanning for the worst cases, her mouth issuing short instructions that cut through panic. Nolan Pierce stumbled along, coughing, humbled, his brilliance useless in smoke, his ego shrinking into something almost human. Mason kept pulling Henderson, then doubled back for another patient, an older man with an IV pole, while Atlas guided the line, barking only when necessary, never wasting sound. Above them, smoke thickened into an inverted ocean, rolling along the ceiling, filling the lights with a sickly gray. Water from sprinklers rained down cold and relentless, soaking scrubs, making skin shiver, making the floor treacherous. Somewhere deeper in the wing, Grant's silhouette lurched near the oxygen room door, and the flicker of flame brightened. Mason's gut clenched again. If that oxygen room became fully involved, this wouldn't just be a fire, it would be a catastrophe. But Mason could not fight Grant and rescue everyone at once. He had to choose the order of miracles. "Keep moving," he shouted toward Jenna, and his voice carried down the wet hall, firm and unbreakable. Jenna looked back once, eyes wide, face streaked, and nodded, pushing the line forward. The stairwell door was ahead, a rectangle of possible salvation. People crawled toward it, hands slipping on tile, bodies shaking, eyes red. Atlas ran to the door, pawed at it, then looked back at Mason as if saying, "This is the way." Mason dragged the trench coat sled another 10 feet. Henderson coughed hard, then rasped, "I hate cardio." And despite everything, a sound like laughter rippled weakly through the chain-small, shaking human. Fear made people obedient. Humor made them alive. Behind them, the orange glow intensified, and Grant's voice ragged, furious echoed once more through the alarms and sprinklers. "You don't get to walk away from her." Mason didn't answer. He didn't waste breath on arguments with grief. He spent breath on pulling. He spent breath on saving. And as the stairwell door finally swung open into cooler air, as bodies began to spill into it in a crawling line like survivors escaping the mouth of a beast, Mason glanced once over his shoulder through the wet smoke and saw Grant still moving, still alive, still dragging his pain toward oxygen and flame, and Mason knew the hospital hadn't finished testing what kind of man a wounded Marine could be. The stairwell didn't disappear with drama. It failed the way exhausted things fail. One groan, one snap, then a violent cough of smoke and debris that turned the doorway into a jagged mouth. Mason Carter had been pushing bodies toward that exit like he was herding souls away from the underworld, but the building chose its own rules. A section of ceiling dropped somewhere above, the metal frame of the fire door buckled, and the clean rectangle of salvation became a choke point of flame-lit rubble. The line that Jenna Park had built, patients on sheets, wheelchairs, Crawling nurses kept moving because humans cling to movement when panic tries to freeze them. But Mason felt the geometry change under his feet. He heard a wet crack as a support gave way, felt the floor tilt just enough to steal traction, and watched two patients stumble backward like the hospital had suddenly exhaled them. Atlas barked once sharp, directional warning, not fear. Mason caught an elderly man by the shoulder with his forearm, shoved him toward Priya Desai, and roared, "Go! Keep going!" His voice cut through the sprinkler roar, through the alarms, through the animal noise people make when they believe they're about to die. Jenna didn't argue. She didn't thank him. She just obeyed, because she understood what soldiers understood. Gratitude is for later, if later exists. Sarah Caldwell was still dragging blankets over heads, her narrow frame soaked, her chestnut hair plastered to her face, her eyes red and stubborn. Dr. Claire Whitman stayed with the moving chain, hands guiding, mouth issuing short instructions like she was back in an operating room, and chaos was just another bleeding vessel to clamp. Dr. Nolan Pierce coughed and stumbled, humbled into silence, his clean world dissolved into smoke. Lillian Hart crawled in the middle like a furious little spirit refusing to be left behind, muttering, "Not today," as if speaking directly to death. Mason watched them spill into the stairwell's lower landing, those who could still pass. Then the passage choked again, and the corridor behind him answered with a different voice. Fire finding oxygen. The air thickened. Heat pressed down from above. Somewhere to his left, beyond a veil of smoke, a child's sob cut through the noise like a thin wire. Mason turned and saw him small, hunched near a doorway, hands over his ears as if trying to block out the world's cruelty. The boy's name band read Leo Bennett. He looked about 9, maybe 10 freckled cheeks smeared with soot, sandy blonde hair, damp and curled against his forehead, eyes wide and bright with terror. His hospital gown hung loose on his thin frame, and his knees were pulled to his chest like he was trying to fold himself into invisibility. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't brave. He was simply too young to understand how quickly a building could decide to become a funeral. A few feet behind Leo, in a room half swallowed by smoke, a ventilator alarm chirped in a steady, indifferent panic. Mason's gaze snapped there and saw the other problem, an adult patient on a bed, pale and unmoving, an oxygen tube and ventilator line tethering him like a lifeline tied to a sinking ship. The chart clipped to the bed frame read, Harold Finch, 62, vent dependent. Harold's face was slack, skin grayish under the harsh lights, a salt and pepper beard trimmed close like a man who'd once been meticulous about appearing put together. Even unconscious, he looked like someone who'd lived with responsibility for a long time, maybe a teacher, maybe an accountant, maybe a man who apologized when other people bumped into him. Mason didn't know Harold's story. He only knew the machine's rhythm and the fact that rhythm didn't care about smoke. The alarms in the hall screamed, the sprinklers hammered down, the ceiling tiles sagged like tired eyelids. And from below, faint, distorted, as if coming through water, Mason heard voices shouting up the stairwell, SWAT. Their commands bounced and warped through the building's guts, sounding like gods arguing in the belly of a whale. Someone banged a door on a lower level. Someone called, "Fourth floor is compromised." Another voice, calm, authoritative, answered, "Keep moving, keep moving." Mason didn't know the man's face, but he pictured him anyway. Captain Marcus Reed, incident commander by the books. In Mason's mind he looked early 40s, shaved head, square jaw, rain beating on a black helmet, the kind of man who didn't waste words because words didn't stop bullets, a man who'd trained to run toward other people's worst minutes and still go home to pretend he wasn't haunted. Mason's throat burned. His injured hand throbbed as if reminding him that pain was the tax for being alive. He looked at Leo. He looked at Harold Finch and the ventilator. He looked at Atlas, who had returned to Mason's side the moment the line broke, wet fur darkened by water, amber eyes reflecting strobe lights like a wolf carved from flame. Atlas's body vibrated with the urge to move, to lead, to bite fate if fate came too close. Mason swallowed and made the decision that always arrived too late and still demanded to be made. He couldn't leave them. Not the boy. Not the man tethered to a machine. Not when he still had legs that worked and a heart that refused to be quiet. "Leo," Mason called, keeping his voice low, not because the situation was gentle, but because children heard calm more clearly than screaming. "Hey, buddy. Look at me." Leo's eyes found him, and the boy shook his head hard, tears mixing with sprinkler water. "I can't," Leo whimpered. "I can't breathe." Mason crouched, staying low to the floor where the air was less poisoned, and pointed at his own mouth. "Small breaths," he said, "like you're blowing out birthday candles, tiny ones. We're going to do it together." He gave Leo a half-smile that felt like a lie and a gift at the same time. "I came in here for stitches," Mason added, letting humor sneak in like a flashlight beam. "Turns out the hospital's offering the deluxe package." Leo made a broken sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. It was enough. Mason reached back and felt for the leash and the knot of fabric at his waist. He'd tied his flannel shirt there earlier, habit. He ripped it free, red and black plaid, soaked and heavy, and looped it quickly around Leo's torso. "This is going to be your seatbelt," Mason said. Leo's eyes widened. "Seatbelt for what?" "For the part where we don't quit," Mason answered, and his voice went colder with resolve. Atlas nudged Leo's knee with his muzzle, gentle, as if the dog was signing the same promise in fur. Mason tugged the shirt tighter, knotting it across Leo's back and then across his own chest, securing the boy to him so Leo's small hands could cling without slipping. Mason's injured hand screamed when he pulled the knot. He ignored it. Then he crawled into Harold Finch's room and assessed the ventilator line with a grim, practical focus. He couldn't haul a ventilator down a broken stairwell. He couldn't carry a full bed through smoke. He could, however, buy time. He grabbed a portable oxygen cylinder from the corner, small, green-topped, the kind used for transport, and rolled it toward the window. The window was reinforced, non-opening, designed to prevent desperate leaps. Mason understood the irony. Safety features were wonderful until fire arrived and demanded a different kind of escape. He raised the cylinder and struck the glass. The first hit rang like a bell. The second made a spiderweb crack bloom. The third, fueled by fear and stubbornness, shattered a section, and wind-driven rain punched into the room, cold as a baptism. The temperature drop slapped Mason's burned throat, and for a moment the rain felt like mercy. But the influx of air also fed the fire somewhere down the hall, and the smoke shifted angrily, swirling like a living thing that didn't want to be denied. Mason looked down. 4 stories. Wet concrete below. Red and blue lights strobed in the storm. Firefighters moved like ants in reflective gear. A ladder truck had extended its arm toward the building, but the wind shoved it around, making the bucket sway like a cradle held by a drunk giant. In the bucket stood a firefighter, Tom O'Neill, broad-shouldered, late 30s, ginger beard plastered with rain, eyes narrowed against the weather. He looked up and saw Mason in the shattered window with a child strapped to his chest, and Mason saw the instant calculation in the firefighter's face: distance, angle, time. Tom yelled something Mason couldn't hear over alarms and wind, but Mason read it on his mouth anyway. "We're coming!" The ladder bucket edged closer, then swung away, then back again. It was close enough to give hope, far enough to make hope hurt. Mason scanned the building's exterior, searching for a second option, because second options were how you stayed alive when the first option didn't arrive on time. To his left, a drainage pipe ran down the brick-rusted, thick, bolted with brackets that looked older than the hospital's paint. It wasn't meant to save anyone. It was meant to carry rain to the ground. Tonight, it became the only honest thing in sight: gravity's handhold. Behind Mason, the hallway roared. Something collapsed. The smoke surged. Mason heard the distant bark of Atlas 1, 2, 3 barks, sharp and spaced, and realized the dog had moved into the corridor again, not to flee, but to signal. Atlas had learned the language of rescue, noise with purpose. Somewhere below, firefighters looked up, following the sound like a beacon. Mason's heart clenched with a brutal tenderness. The dog was staying behind the line for one reason, to keep humans pointed at the right window. Mason leaned out, rain whipping his face, and shouted down with every ounce of his lungs, "Fourth floor! Right here!" His voice shredded. Leo whimpered against his chest, small hands clenching Mason's jacket like a prayer. "Do you trust me?" Mason asked, and his tone softened in a way that made the question feel mythic, like a warrior asking a child to believe in an invisible bridge. "No," Leo sobbed honestly. Mason almost smiled. "Good," he said. "Then trust the knot." He tightened the makeshift harness once more. His injured hand burned like it had been dipped in salt. He didn't let go. Mason looked at the swaying ladder bucket, still not close enough, still fighting wind, and then looked at the drainage pipe. He made the choice that soldiers made when doors didn't open. He went through the wall. He stepped onto the cracked sill, rain slicking his boots, the city yawning below like a mouth waiting for a story to end. Atlas barked again from somewhere behind, a steady drumbeat. "Here, here, here." The firefighter in the bucket reached out, gloved hand stretching toward empty air. Mason did not jump for the hand, he jumped for the pipe. The leap was short in distance and endless in meaning. For a heartbeat he was weightless, suspended between fire and fall, between the hospital's white light and the storm's black mercy. His right hand injured, bandaged missed. His left hand caught the pipe with a brutal, perfect grip. Metal bit into his palm, pain detonated up his arm. His shoulder jolted, nearly tearing loose. Leo screamed into Mason's chest. Mason's boot slammed against the brick, scraping. He dangled. One arm, one child. Wind and rain. The hospital behind him coughed flame from the shattered window, like a dragon refusing to let its prey go. Mason pressed his forehead to the wet pipe for a fraction of a second, breathing through agony, and told himself the only truth that mattered. He did not need to be unhurt to hold on. Below, the ladder bucket swayed closer, the firefighter shouting, eyes wide, reaching up again. Mason shifted his body, inch by inch, trying to swing toward the bucket without slipping, trying to keep Leo's weight centered, trying to ignore the way his injured hand throbbed uselessly at his side. And behind him, inside the burning room, Atlas's bark kept time like a war drum, marking the spot where the world still owed them a way down. Rain kept falling like the city was trying to rinse the night clean, but Seattle couldn't wash away what had happened on the 4th floor. Mason Carter hung on the drainage pipe with a child strapped to his chest, his body trembling from strain, the wet metal biting into his palm like a debt collector. The world below spun in red and blue flashes, sirens blurring into one long cry. The ladder bucket surged closer, swayed away, then corrected again as the wind bullied it like an angry god. Tom O'Neill leaned out from the bucket, ginger beard dark with rain, eyes fierce with that firefighter stubbornness that refused to accept too far as an answer. "I got you!" Tom shouted, voice shredded by wind. His gloved hand reached, and this time it wasn't empty air. This time it found Leo's small wrist. Mason shifted his body in a controlled swing, pain exploding through his shoulder, and pushed the boy outward with his forearm, guiding him like passing a fragile package across a cliff. Leo's fingers slipped, then caught. Tom hauled the boy into the bucket, wrapping him in an arm that felt like safety made flesh. Leo sobbed, gasping, eyes wild, then turned toward Mason with terror. "Mason!" he cried, the name breaking out of him like a prayer. Mason's jaw clenched. He didn't answer with comfort. He answered with instruction, because instruction was what kept panic from killing people. "Stay down in the bucket," he ordered. And even through the storm, the tone made Leo obey. Mason's grip on the pipe faltered. His injured hand bandaged, swollen, furious, couldn't help. His left shoulder screamed with each micro-movement. The pipe was slick. The building behind him coughed flame out of the shattered window like it wanted to reclaim him. Tom swung the bucket lower, trying to align it under Mason's boots. And Mason made the only choice left. He let go at the right second, not when fear told him, but when geometry allowed it. He dropped into the bucket's metal cradle and hit the floor hard, folding like a man finally permitted to be human. Tom grabbed him by the collar, keeping him from sliding. "Easy," Tom said, voice suddenly softer, the way men got when the danger wasn't over, but the worst of it had loosened its grip. "You're safe." Mason's laugh came out ugly and breathless. "Safe's a strong word," he rasped, throat raw from smoke. The bucket descended, swaying, lowering toward the wet pavement where firefighters and police swarmed like a living machine. The moment the basket touched down, hands reached up, dozens of them pulling Leo out first, then Mason, as if the ground itself was grateful to have them back. Leo collapsed into the arms of a paramedic, still trembling, still alive. Mason's boots hit asphalt, and his knees threatened to give. The adrenaline that had held him upright finally began to drain, leaving pain behind like the tide leaving wreckage on shore. Captain Marcus Reed pushed through the chaos, helmet wet, face set in that hard calm leaders wore when they didn't want their fear to infect anyone else. Reed's build was solid, broad-chested, early 40s, with close-cropped hair and a jaw that looked like it had learned to say no to sleep. His eyes flicked over Mason's injuries, then to the building, then to the ladder. "You the one who went out the window?" he demanded. Mason didn't answer immediately. He turned his head toward the building and listened. Amid sirens and shouting, there was a sound that mattered more. A bark sharp, steady, purposeful coming from above. Atlas, still inside, still signaling. Mason's chest tightened. "My dog," Mason croaked, and the words came out like a confession. "He's up there." Reed's gaze hardened. "We've got teams going in," he said, but his eyes told the truth. The fourth floor was a furnace. Even the brave didn't go in without calculating how many deaths their courage could afford. Before Mason could lurch forward, a firefighter shouted from the stairwell exit, "We've got a K-9 coming down!" And then Atlas appeared through the smoke at the lower landing, wet fur clinging to his ribs, muzzle dark with soot, eyes still burning with purpose. He trotted, not limping, not collapsing, as if stubbornness alone had built him a spine of iron. A firefighter held the leash, coughing, eyes watering, and the dog's gaze found Mason immediately. Atlas didn't leap. He simply walked up and pressed his head into Mason's thigh with a quiet force that said, "Mission complete, but don't you dare fall apart yet." Mason's hand, his good hand, found Atlas's neck and gripped the fur like a lifeline. For a second, he let his forehead drop against the dog's head, and the world narrowed into warmth and breath and the relief that loyalty was not just a story people told, it was real and heavy and alive. Across the wet lot, Dr. Claire Whitman stood under the awning of an emergency tent, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket that made her look like a soldier from a different kind of war. Her hair had come loose from its bun, strands plastered to her temples. Rain and soot marked her face in streaks, and her hands shook not from cold alone, but from the deeper tremor of a mind trying to make sense of accusation and fire and survival. She watched paramedics wheel out patients. Lillian Hart shouting at them to "Move faster!" Priya Desai still counting breaths with a patient even outside the building because her calm didn't turn off. Sarah Caldwell sitting on the curb with her knees hugged to her chest, sobbing as if the night had finally allowed her to release everything she'd been holding in. Nolan Pierce stood nearby, staring at his hands like he expected to find blood on them. Claire's eyes followed Mason as he emerged with soot on his face, and Atlas pressed to his side like a shadow that refused to leave. Her expression held gratitude and dread in the same breath. She took a step toward him, blanket slipping from her shoulders, and her voice came thin, almost ashamed. Did anyone die?" Mason blinked against rain. "Not tonight," Captain Reed said before Mason could answer, voice firm. "We're still accounting, but your chain got most of them down." Claire's shoulders sagged, relief and horror tangling together. Then the old question clawed back into her. She looked at Mason with eyes that suddenly didn't belong to a surgeon. They belonged to a woman who had once promised a husband hope and then lived with the consequences when hope failed. "He said," "I killed her," Claire whispered. "Grant said I killed Marissa." Her throat worked. What if I did something wrong?" Mason had heard that question in different uniforms, different places. He'd heard it in a young Marine who survived an explosion when his friend didn't. He'd heard it in a medic who couldn't stop a bleed. He'd heard it in himself at 3 a.m., staring at a ceiling that never answered back. The truth was complicated. The truth was that medicine was not magic, and war was not fair, and the universe sometimes flipped a coin and called it fate. Mason looked at Claire, at the shaking hands that had saved strangers 1,000 times, at the haunted eyes that had watched hearts stop, and he understood something sharper than facts. Tonight, Claire was standing on the edge of a cliff inside her own mind. If she fell, no ladder truck could reach her. Mason could have offered the cold truth, that complications happened, that death didn't always have a culprit, that guilt was often a liar wearing a familiar face. But he saw the way Claire's breath hitched, the way her shoulders curled inward as if bracing for a verdict. She didn't need a lecture, she needed a stitch. Mason chose mercy the way he'd chosen survival deliberately. "You did the best you could," Mason said, voice rough but steady. He didn't say it like a cliché. He said it like a man making a promise with words, because sometimes that was the only bandage available. Claire's eyes widened, and a sob slipped out of her, small and broken. "You don't know that," she whispered. Mason's jaw tightened. "I know what trying looks like," he replied, "and I saw you tonight. You didn't hide. You didn't run. You stayed with the patients. That's not a killer." Claire's breath shuddered out, and the tremor in her hands softened. Not gone, never gone, but eased, like a knot loosened just enough for blood to return to a limb. Across the lot, police officers dragged Grant Kessler out in cuffs, wrist splinted, face bruised, rage finally trapped inside metal. He shouted something, Marissa's name maybe, or his own pain, before an officer pushed him into the back of a cruiser. The crowd of staff watched in stunned silence. No one cheered. No one felt victorious. It was hard to celebrate when the air still smelled like smoke and fear. News vans arrived fast, headlights cutting through rain, cameras hunting for a face to label hero. A reporter tried to step in front of Mason, microphone extended like a spear. "Sir, what's your name? Are you a veteran? How did you—" Mason lifted a hand, not the injured one, and shook his head once, small. "No," he said, the same word he'd used in the hallway when he refused to kneel. He looked down at Atlas, then back at the reporter, and something like humor flickered in his soot-blackened face. "I came for stitches," he muttered. "That's still the plan." The reporter blinked, thrown off script. "You saved—" "I didn't save," Mason interrupted, not angry, just tired. "We did." He nodded toward Jenna, who was wrapped in a blanket, face pale, eyes still scanning as if she couldn't stop counting. He nodded toward Priya, who still had a hand on a patient's shoulder. He nodded toward Sarah, whose tears had finally turned into shaky laughter because she was alive and couldn't believe it. Then he looked at Atlas again. "And he did," Mason added, scratching behind the dog's bent ear. "He stayed when he could have run." Tom O'Neill approached, rain dripping from his helmet brim, and offered Mason a small foil-wrapped item from a firefighter's ration pack. "Best I can do," Tom said, grin faint. "Not a steak, but it's meat." Mason stared at it for a second, then huffed a laugh. "You just made a German Shepherd's whole year," he said, and handed it down to Atlas, who accepted it with the solemn dignity of a knight receiving tribute. Later, when the worst was truly over and the building was finally just a building again, Mason sat on a gurney inside the ER, under bright white light that made everything look too honest. A nurse cleaned his wounded hand while he stared at the ceiling, letting the adrenaline drain in slow, aching waves. The cut was deep, it needed stitches. The irony wasn't lost on him. After everything, he was back where he'd started. Dr. Claire Whitman stepped into the bay, no longer wrapped in foil, hair still damp, eyes still haunted but steadier. She watched the nurse work on Mason's hand, then looked at him like she owed him more than thanks. Mason spoke first, because silence could become a trap. "You okay?" he asked simply. Claire let out a shaky breath and almost laughed at how ridiculous that question was after fire and guns and falling. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm here." Mason nodded. "That's the stitch," he said quietly. "You keep showing up. Eventually the rip holds." Claire's eyes filled, but this time she didn't collapse into it. She nodded too. Outside the curtain, the hospital hummed on, machines beeping, wheels rolling, voices calling codes and names, because life was stubborn, and St. Jude's was built for stubbornness. Mason flexed his fingers as the nurse tied off the final suture. He looked down at his hand, then at Atlas sitting beside the gurney like a loyal statue in a soaked coat of black and tan. "We're done?" Mason asked the nurse. The nurse, young, tired, kind, smiled weakly. "For tonight," she said. Mason exhaled. "Good," he murmured, and for the first time all night his shoulders lowered. The news would call him a hero. The city would hand out keys and plaques and applause. Mason didn't want any of it. He only wanted two things that felt mythically rare: a quiet life and a dog with a full belly. And as the hospital's white halls glowed behind the curtains, the lesson settled softly into everyone who survived. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear a worn leather jacket, a bandaged hand, and they walk in beside a German shepherd who's more faithful than any oath. That night, in the rain-soaked glow of Seattle and the sterile white of a hospital hall, the miracle didn't arrive with thunder or a choir of light. It arrived the way God often chooses to mend a broken world, quietly, through ordinary hands that refuse to let go. A wounded palm still held on. A frightened child still learned to breathe. A doctor stayed standing when shame tried to crush her, and a loyal German shepherd barked in measured beats like heaven itself was knocking 4 paws, one mission, mercy on schedule. Sometimes people miss miracles because they expect fireworks, but God's miracles often wear smoke, exhaustion, and soaked clothes. Sometimes a miracle is a single sentence spoken at the right moment, soft enough to spare a soul from splitting open. You did the best you could. Not because truth is ignored, but because compassion is the final stitch that keeps a heart from tearing. God doesn't always put out the fire instantly, but He lights courage inside people, and that courage becomes the answer to someone else's prayer. And that's the holy twist. Sometimes God doesn't send an angel with wings. He sends a tired, ordinary person with scars, and a faithful dog who won't abandon the living. So if you're living in the everyday work, bills, family worries, stress that follows you into the quiet, remember this: miracles in daily life are rarely loud. They look like patience when you want to snap, a kind word when you're running on empty, a hand reached out when someone is drowning in fear. Today, God may be asking you to be a small stitch in someone's life so they don't come apart from loneliness, guilt, or grief. And maybe, gently, God is also preparing someone to be that stitch for you. Before you go, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what's one time you felt God's help or a miracle show up in an unexpected way? If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. And may God bless you and your family, keep you safe, strengthen you in hard seasons, and fill your days with peace that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. Amen.